We tried it. All right, we're going to move on, and we're going to be working through this Fonts with CSS handout. If you should happen to lose it or not have it with you, it is in Blackboard right here, so you can click on that. And again, stapled here in class, pages 2 and 3 are flipped, they're out of order, but I believe in the CSS, I actually scanned them in the right order, so they are available on Blackboard. So we're going to work through the last half of the same PowerPoint to learn about stylizing type. So, we've been using CSS to keep all of our style on a separate file, and the reason that we do that is because it's so much easier to keep the basic information, the content of your website, separate from how it looks, right? Because if you have a client who changes their mind a lot about looks, or if you want to be the person who seasonally changes your website a little to kind of reflect seasonal colors, you don't want to have to go into all 700 pages and at the top of each page change, or worse yet, line by line, inline code. You don't want to stylize it there. And you don't even want to do an embedded CSS where it's different for page by page, because that's, if you have a 700-page website, that's 700 pages to open and change. The one CSS file, external, is the way to go. So far, everything we've been looking at has been showing up in the default fonts of Google Chrome in my case. And so when we've been looking at Pacific Trails, it's been this font, which Times New Roman tends to be the default font for most web browsers. So if that's not what you had in mind and you want something different, or maybe you want your headings to be different, your body type can still be Times New Roman or whatever you choose, you can actually make those decisions and stylize your type within CSS. So first of all, we need to understand what different fonts are. From a design standpoint, we have serif and sans serif type. Serifs are the little feet at the bottom of the letters. So Times New Roman has these little like bricks at the bottoms of all of the letters and some of the tops of the letters. Those are called serifs. So those are easier to read in print by far. If you read a book, it usually has serif type in it. Something about the little serifs helps your eye move along and read. Sans serif type, sans means without, does not have serifs. So this is sans serif. Notice there's no little bricks at the bottom of all the letter forms, right? So Arial, Helvetica, Verdana, those are sans serif. Times New Roman, Georgia, Palatino, those are serif types. Sans serif type tends to look better on websites because on a web page, on any monitor or iPad or your phone, the way that it's working is that pixels are being lit up from behind. So it would have to light up a teeny tiny pixel to make the serifs on the Times show up. So the smaller you get, the harder it is for serif type to look good on screens. So a lot of times we'll use sans serif type on websites. Monospace type is the kind that is like an old typewriter, where every letter, no matter how wide it is or thin, like an M to an I, it still gets the same physical amount of space. And that, therefore, there's sometimes weird space in between them. So Courier, Lucinda Console, those are examples. Cursive or handwritten, you guys understand what they're going to look like. They look scripty, they look like they're done by hand. And then fantasy or display type, as it's often called, are the other things, like the weird stuff that you see maybe on headings or headlines. So these are some of the worst examples on earth: Jokerman, Impact, and Papyrus. Comic Sans could be added to either handwritten or display. Comic Sans is highly laughed at and frowned upon in the design world. So if you want to be considered a professional and you're working at your business, don't use Comic Sans. You guys know what it looks like, right? Kind of like a comic book. Yeah. It is not professional. Don't do your memos in it. Don't do your posters in it at work. It's not meant for professionalism at all, and it's really not a good font. So how we actually make fonts work in our CSS is we use this property called font family. And then we tell whatever we're targeting what font family we want it to use, but we give it some choices. So in this case, in our CSS code, P means what in HTML?
Paragraph.
Paragraph. So anything that's inside a paragraph, here's a rule that you must abide by. The font family I want you to use is Verdana, first choice. If you don't have Verdana, use Arial. If you don't have Arial, use any sans serif. Any guesses why we give it 3 choices? This relies on what the viewer's computer has installed. So if my grandma doesn't have Verdana installed on her computer, and if that's all I ask for, we'd have problems. Most people have Verdana, everybody pretty much has Arial, but even if they don't, sans serif means whatever sans serif you got, use it. It'll be fine. So you're giving it the choices in order of your importance from a design standpoint. The other trick, and we'll maybe see this, I'm not sure if we do or not, if the font name is more than one word, like Times New Roman, you have to put it in quotation marks. If it's a one-word font, you don't have to. Also make sure that sans serif is hyphenated and there's an S. It's sans with an S plural. So again, spelling it absolutely correctly is critical. All right, so common design practice is that serif fonts are used for headings, the ones with the little feet on them. And a sans serif font is usually used on a web or digital display for content. So you can do that. And also we tend to make them look good together but be opposite. So headings look different than your body copy. The trick, like I said, is that the font that you ask for needs to be installed on the user's computer. And if not, they're just going to substitute a default font. So if for some reason, this is bizarre, but if they didn't have Verdana, Arial, or any sans serif installed, which wouldn't happen, it would go back to the default of the browser, which is Times New Roman. So that's why we always add that generic version at the end to cover this. All right, hands-on in your handout on page 158, which is the bottom of that very first handout, we are going to go back to Trillium. So let's first go into Notepad, and let's close out the 3 Pacific Trails files that we're working on. We don't need to look at those again, so just close those out. Then I want you to navigate to your desktop or your jump drive or wherever you have your Trillium folder that we've been working on in class, and open the Trillium folder. And we have some images. We didn't put these in a separate image folder right now, and that's fine, but just notice how they're out and about now. Let's go into a list view details. So we have a contact GIF, which is an image, that's that button. We have a contact HTML page, that's the actual page. So this is where it can get a little confusing, and when having a separate folder called images can be really quite helpful. So we have 3 pages of HTML, contact, index, services, and we have our CSS called Trillium right here. So let's open those 4 documents that we can open in WordPad. So contact, hold down the control button and choose index, services, and Trillium. And make sure you're not taking the images, you're actually taking the 3 HTML files and the 1 CSS. And then right click and choose Edit in Notepad++. So here we have our 3 pages, services, index, contact, and our Trillium CSS. And as a refresher, if we run this page, oh man, this is how we have it looking so far. So the images that we've used are, we put a background image in our header, and then for our navigation, instead of using text words, we included 3 buttons, and we made those be hyperlinks to other pages. That's what we did last week. Everybody good with where we are? Have this open? Okay. So let's turn it over to page 159. And it says launch a text editor, open the starter file, ignore that. We've got our index file already. And then they want us, they're saying to configure an embedded CSS. We've already moved beyond that. On all three of these pages, we've made an external style sheet and called for it. So all three of our HTML pages in the head section already have this command that tells it to link to a style sheet named Trillium CSS. So all we need to do is make these changes to our CSS page now. So if you switch to the CSS document that we have started already, so far we have, I'm going to just put some spaces here. We have CSS or styling written for 4 different things. Our body, which is every single thing we see on our page. Our heading 1s act a different way. Our heading 2s act a different way. And our images, we added the code that tells it, because they're hyperlinks, those buttons for home, contact, and services, we added a code that said, basically don't put that bright blue outline around it, that hyperlink outline around it when we hover over it. We don't want that. So that's what that thing says. So number 1 on the top of 159, instead of doing this embedded, we're doing it to our external style sheet. They say configure the body element selector to set global styles to use a sans serif typeface, such as Verdana or Arial. So in our body, we already have 4 rules. So after that last rule and the semicolon, I like to go down the line so I can read them all, we're going to add a 4th rule. And it's going to be font-family, colon, and then we list them in order, and of course you have to spell them right. So Verdana is our first choice, comma. Arial is our second choice, and then if the end user has none of those, sans-serif, semicolon. And again, it's good practice to end your last rule with a semicolon because you might be adding more. And if you do, when you jump down to that next line, if you've forgotten the semicolon here, it's going to break the code and not work. So it's always good practice to end with it, even if you think you're done. All right, step 2 says configure the heading 1 and the heading 2 element selectors to use a serif type, such as Georgia or Times New Roman. And then it says, note that Times New Roman has quotes because it's more than a single word. So let's start with our H1 and add a 4th rule to that. Font family, colon, and then we're going to do Georgia as our first choice. And then Times New Roman, and because it's multiple words, we have to put it in quotation marks. Times New Roman. And then our last choice is just a generic serif font, if they don't have either of our first 2 choices. That's the exact same rule they want us to use on our heading 2. So instead of retyping it, we can, if it's clean and good, we can highlight it and copy and paste it into our heading 2 rules. And then step 3 says configure the footer element selector, so everything in the footer, to use a serif font such as Georgia or Times New Roman. So the example is the same thing. So ironically, it's the exact same rule as our heading 1 and heading 2s. But do we have a rule for footer yet? No, so we need to make one brand new. So on a new line, the thing that we're targeting is the footer. So we start with that. And then in curly braces, we put all of the rules that apply to our footer. And in this case, it's going to be the same font family. I'm going to just copy and paste this again. Or you can retype it. So we have one rule for the footer. That also should be Georgia, Times New Roman, and serif. If we type this in and it's good, we're going to save the CSS file. Make sure you save it, and then go back to your index file and see what it looks like now. Run it in Chrome. Oh. So we see serif typefaces up here with the little feet. So our header Heading 1, our heading 2s are serif. Navigation is a button. It's actually a picture or a graphic, so those didn't change. And then our paragraphs, the body type, is in a sans serif text. We haven't controlled the size or anything else about it yet, but we have controlled the name of the font that's used. And then our footer went back down here to being a serif type again. So we changed the look of that just by giving some rules in our style sheet. You guys okay with that?
No, can you go back to your...
All right, so again, really important. Curly brace, open and close, surrounds all of the rules for that one particular selector, the one element that you're targeting. And remember, semicolons at the end of each rule so that you can always add another one underneath it. Okay. Did that. Okay, so web safe fonts. These are the fonts that exist on a person's computer, and you know that your page is going to display it the way you intended it to because you're using the web safe fonts. This list used to be about 8 to 10 fonts long. Times New Roman, Georgia, Verdana, Arial, Helvetica, Comic Sans was one of them. Impact was one of them. There were about 8 fonts that were considered web safe. Therefore, if you use those, you knew your page would look right on anybody and everybody's. Guess what? They're ugly, and that's why Comic Sans actually got overused so much, because it was installed in every Mac and PC as a default font. So, if that's all you could use for design, your web pages are going to be pretty ugly and pretty boring. So the cool thing is that we now have something called web fonts, and there's different ways of using them. Google has fonts that you can use, and then other places like Font Squirrel have display fonts that you can use commercially free. Their licenses are great, and all you need to do is just include this @fontface reference or whatever code Google tells you to do. So I'm going to show you. No, I'll be darned. This is not. I had another link in here when I did this originally. Hold on.
Quick video tutorial on how to add Google Web Fonts to your website. First thing you want to do is go to google.com/webfonts. Once there, you can browse the library of available fonts, find the one that you like, and then add it to your website. In our case, we want handwriting, font type, we're going to click handwriting, click OK, scroll down, this guy right here is the one we want, click use, scroll down once again, and step number 3, we're going to copy out that link, go to our text editor, you're going to paste that link in that you just copied out. Going back to our browser, we're going to go to step number 4, select font family, go back to the text editor, go to the CSS file, and in your CSS file, just paste in that font family. Go back to your HTML file. What we just did is we added a link in our HTML file that references the font that we chose. Under that you see we have a link to our style sheet, and then below that we have our H1 tag. So in our style sheet we added our font family to our H1 tag, so all this content directly in here should be affected by this new Google font. If we save that document, go to our browser, you'll now see our awesome Google font. Thanks for watching.
All right, was that so fast that it made you dizzy? But did it make sense? Pretty much. I mean, it's pretty simple. You find a font that you like, so this Pacifico, if we go and look at this one, for example, click on this plus to select this. And it gives you all the information right here. And there's always options, extra videos you can watch. But it says, to embed this font into a web page, copy this code into the head section of your HTML document, and then specify it in the CSS as well. So here's a link for this browser to know where to go find this font. So I'm going to give it a whirl here, copy. And that needs to go, like it said, in the head section of your HTML document. So I'm going to pop back to our Trillium page. I'm going to go to our index, And in the head section, which is what just the browser and the search engines are reading, I'm going to give it another link. So far we've told it that there's a style sheet out there called Trillium that it should look for. And we've now also told it that there's another style sheet out there called an actual hyperlink to go to Google to get the Google font. So it knows where to go and look, but we haven't told any particular part of our design to be a specific look. And typically what we'd want to do is we'd want to give maybe our heading 2s. So wherever we see new media design and meeting your business needs, maybe those are the words that we want stylized in this new font. So go back to your browser, and then here's the rule that you need. So it's saying font family is Pacifico. Notice there's single quotes around it, which means it's like a Google font or something above and beyond. It's not local on the person's computer. Copy that, hop back to your CSS, and then we have to target the 1 or 2 things that we want to look this way. Specifically, we want it to be our heading 2s. So instead of font family of Georgia and Times New Roman, we want it to be this Pacifico or a cursive generic font. So if all went well, of course it won't just because that's the way life goes. Hey, ugly. I don't like it at all. It looks like Comic Sans. But it's different, right?
What? That's
looks
not
different.
how that looks.
Yeah. You chose a different one?
I don't know. What'd you guys choose?
Pacific.
So did I. Pacifico cursive. Well, what the? You guys have it looking good?
Yeah. It
Sweet.
looks nice. I'd use it.
Come on, take a look.
Yeah, that's much prettier than the junk I have. Huh. So guess what you get to do then? You get to troubleshoot. So where did I go wrong? In my CSS, is this exactly what you have? Font family. Did you leave the line about, no, never mind. Pacifico cursive. HTML. Here's the style. Well, isn't that Pacifico?
It didn't work.
This one?
Oh yeah. Looks the same. Yeah, there you go. Sometimes I need a little refresher.
Refresh, copy, save, redo. Huh. So, from a design standpoint, this might be
Mine did not work.
much better, much more what you're looking for. In the old days, before web fonts were available, if we wanted that font to be our headers, the only way we could do it would be to make that as a graphic, like they did with these buttons up here. So we would make a rectangle with light green background. We would do this in Photoshop, and we would save it as an image and plop it in that way. The bad part about that is that screen readers and search engine robots can't, all they can do is look at an alt tag of an image. They can't actually read the words. Whereas, because this is pure HTML, when we go back and look at our code page, anything that's in a heading 1 or a heading 2, these search engine robots know are important. So they actually read those as real text, and they go ahead and file your website as, okay, this has something to do with web design and new media, and it helps with search engine results. So you certainly do not ever have to do that, but I just wanted to show you that beyond the basic fonts, there are these web fonts, and there's a bunch of them. Google Fonts is probably the easiest and safest. Font Squirrel is another option for you. So that was the lower half of page 159 in the handout. If you didn't do that, if you left it with the serif and sans serif, perfectly fine. Do not worry about that. So, other things we can do with CSS besides give it a font family is we can do all these other different cool things. We can tell it what size to be, what weight to be, so like bold or semi-bold, condensed, things like that. Font styles, similar, condensed, all caps. Line height is how much space is between your lines. So like in Word, you can do 1.5 line spacing or double line spacing or whatever. Text align, do you want this text flush left? That's the default. Or do you want it centered? Text decoration is what the text looks like. So typically, and especially old school, when you hover over a hyperlinked word, it would turn blue, bold, and maybe italicized while you're hovering on it because it's a hyperlink. If you don't want that to happen, because blue is the default color, maybe it doesn't work with your design, or maybe it's just annoying, and you just want it to maybe be bold or have no decoration, that text decoration is one of the CSS things that you use. So, how we give a font a size, there's 4 different ways, but there's a couple that are kind of preferred. So, let's look at things that we might understand a little bit better. Do we understand points, 12-point type? When you guys write a paper, it's always 12-point type, right? That's a nice readable size. Because of that, that is the font size that's considered 100%. So if you say nothing else, your body copy is going to be 12-point Times New Roman if the browser has to make the decision. If you want it to be a little bit bigger, you can use CSS to call it bigger things using percentage numbers. So 200% is double a 12-point type. It would be 24-point type. That would give you that tall type. The other way you can name it is by pixels or by ems. These are more print-related in graphic design, but they also are very specific and work very well. And there's also just plain old words. So have we used the small tag already? I think we have in our footers. Didn't we put that around our footer to tell it to be smaller? And that relates to 10-point type. So for accessibility recommendations, for screen readers, for people that rely on that, they recommend that you use ems or percentage font sizes because they can easily be enlarged on all browsers. So if you coded it to be 200% and that's only 24-point type and someone has poor vision and they need it to be 48, their screen reader can easily scale it up bigger and bigger. So those are the recommendations. This is something that a web developer knows about, but I just wanted to share it with you. So hands-on on page 161. We're going to do some of these, not all of these. First of all, before we get there, I wanted to mention here, I wanted to talk about these before we actually do this. So the font weight, the default for that is normal, but if you wanted it to be bold, that's where you would tell it to do that. So we can do in CSS what I've already taught you to do in HTML. Line by line, we were wrapping things in B tags, bold or strong. That's kind of the outdated way of going about it. Now what we like to do is have our HTML just be the content, and we do all of our stylizing through style sheets. So font weight, bold is how we get that to happen. And in this case, what specifically would be made bold if this was the rule I had in there? What's this dude?
List.
List item. So it's your bullet point, right? That, or it's the actual list item in a list. Font styles. Normal is the default, but if you want italic or oblique, this is where you tell it. So instead of using I for italics or EM for emphasis, we could do it in here. Line height, like I said, 200% is double-spaced lines. Text decoration removes the default underlining from hyperlinks in that blue factor. Text transform configures the capitalization of text. So by default, nothing happens, but if you wanted it to be capitalized, uppercase, or lowercase, you could just do it here. Rather than going back and typing it differently in the code, you could say all H3s should now be uppercase, even if I didn't type them in that way in my code page. The rule is uppercase. And then letter spacing configures the space between text characters. So that's kind of like tracking when you get a little bit of a white space or a lot of white space between individual letters. That individual code right there on our heading 1 would put 3 pixels of space between each letter. Okay, so there's a CSS way to do all the HTML stuff we've been learning so far. So the font weight of bold allows us to go into our HTML and wipe out all the page-by-page times that we called up Bs or strongs. Font style italic allows us to go into HTML and clean up all the Is or EMs. That way, all of our stylizing is in one place. So now let's do hands-on on page 161. And we're going to skip a bunch of this also because we didn't do classes and IDs. I didn't teach any of that. So it says launch a text editor with our index. We already have that. And we're also not doing embedded. We're doing external CSS. So our Trillium page, we're skipping number 1. We talked about background positioning and repeats, but I don't feel it's important for you guys to have to code that or know that. But let's jump to step 2. It says add a style declaration for the H1 element that tells the line height property to be 200%. So, for example, line height, 200%. So, in here, on the H1, we just need a new rule, and we're going to say line height, colon, 200%, and then a semicolon, because that's our last rule. On number 3, it says configure the nav element selector to display the text in bold. So anything that's in our nav, do we have a rule for that yet?
No.
Nope. So we need to make another rule. How you put these on your page, this is important, does not matter. I could jump way down here to line 29 and write in nav. The rule for it can go there. But what I found is when I'm going back and troubleshooting and trying to figure out my CSS page, it makes more sense for things to be in the order that I expect them to be in. The body is the universal rules for everything. Then we tend to have rules for the header. Then our navigation tends to come next. Then the next things are like H1, H2, images, and footers. I like to kind of put them in order of what I expect to see. So I might, because of that, put my nav rule up higher on this page, but you do not have to. That's the be-all, end-all. So nav, curly brace, and the rule for the nav is that the font weight, colon, is going to be bold. So there's my one rule for the navigation. Now what we need to do is go back and look at our, let's save it before we forget. Let's go back and look at our index page and actually go to the navigation. In our HTML from a couple weeks ago, we told that to be bold using bold tags. We don't need to have that there anymore. That's redundant because we're telling it the rule in our style sheet. So in our HTML, we can delete out those opening and closing bold tags because not important anymore. Now everything inside my nav tags is going to be applied the rule that navigation has a font weight of bold. Okay? So on all 3 of your HTML pages, you can go and delete out the bold tags that are in the navigation section itself. They're no longer needed. And leaving them there would just be redundant. And again, the better rule of thumb is to keep your HTML clean with just pure content and do all your stylizing in the style sheet itself. Back on page 161, we're skipping number 4 because we didn't talk about classes. Number 5, add a style rule to the footer. So I think we do have a footer rule started. Yep, right down here. And they want us to configure small text. Specifically, they want us to do it in M's, 0.8 M's, that's in italics. So we already have a rule for our font family in our footer. Now we're going to add a rule for font size, and it's going to be 0.80 EM, that's a measurement, M's, and the other rule that we're going to do is font, style, colon, is italic. They have them written on one line left to right. That's perfectly fine. That's the way code reads. I like to put them down one line. I like to do a rule line by line so it's easier to see what I have. So this told our footer to be small and italics. Guess what we can go do now in our HTML code? Any guesses?
Get rid of the italics in the footer.
Yep. So in our footer, we had put a text version of our navigation because the one at the top of the page was all images, so we're going to leave that alone. But when we get down here to the copyright and your name, we have small and I. we no longer need those because that's being told to happen in our style rules. So we can wipe out that. So our footer has bold hyperlinks that are words. It has a line break, and then it has the copyright information and your name. And if we do that on all 3 pages, take out the small and the italic in your footer, and save the pages before you move on. So we started by writing all of these rules directly within our HTML, but we're seeing real quickly how doing it externally in the style sheet is faster and works better. So hopefully, this is going to look very similar when we run it now. So now when we look at our footer section, the words home, services, and contact are also italicized and small because they live within the footer, and we gave the rule to everything in the footer, and that's perfectly fine. All right. All right, let's move on to the last couple of pages in here. And the last thing I want to talk to you about is aligning text using CSS. So we talked about that briefly. Everything aligned to the left is the default, but if you want something different, like centered or justified, you have to use the property text-align, and that will change that. If you want to indent your type, like the first line of a paragraph or something, you could do a text indent, and then you're going to name it an actual physical measurement. So either pixels, points, or ems, or a percentage. Well, let's finish on the back of this page and look at the last page of our handout is page 163, and we're skipping number 1, and we are going to do number 2. Number 2 says to configure the paragraph element selector to indent the text of the first line. So back in our CSS rules, we need to add a rule for Ps, or paragraphs, and we do not have one, correct?
Correct.
Correct. So somewhere on your style sheet, add a new rule for a paragraph, P, and do your curly brace. And the rule for that is text indent, and we're going to give it 3 M's, and those all run together, 3 EM semicolon. And then the last rule that they want us to do is all the text in the footer, they want to be centered on the page. So we're going to go to our footer. We currently have 3 rules. The last rule we want to give it is that everything in the footer should be centered. So we're going to write in text align, center, and then a semicolon. So you have to spell it right. And when we save that and run any of our pages, we now see that our paragraphs have been indented by 3 M's, which is a measurement. And we see that our footer is now centered. All good?
All good.
All good in the hood. The last thing on the page in that FAQ section is, what if you want to write comments, either to yourself to remind yourself or to the next person that uses your files? If you use on CSS pages, if you use \**, and then after you write your human words, or the opposite, asterisk, \\\, those comments are ignored by browsers. So right at the bottom of the slide, I have anything you write here is a comment that browsers ignore, but humans can read. So sometimes you'll see this in codes. People might write up at the very top, they might write \\*, and then this is my style sheet for Trillium. Ding dong. Whoops. Dong. Ugh. And that is something that a human can see, but browsers will ignore. So every now and then, if you want to write a note to yourself or to somebody else using the file, just enclose it in these marks and it will work. And it can be very helpful when you're working on a file with more than one person. That wraps up this handout. So is everybody okay with what we did? All right, then let's take a break.